In 1990, contractors found a hidden room in the agent's basement. Inside, his badge was sitting on a dusty table, right in the center of a small wooden desk. For 5 years, the house had been a quiet tomb of unanswered questions. Sarah Sullivan had walked these floors, cooked in the kitchen, slept in the bedroom, all while living on top of a secret she never knew existed. The workers had been hired to add a small wine cellar, a project her husband, Agent Daniel Sullivan, had always talked about but never started. They were knocking down a section of the concrete foundation wall when one of them felt it give way too easily. Behind the crumbling plaster and wire mesh was not dirt and stone, but empty, black space. A hollow sound echoed back at them. One of the men shone his flashlight into the dark. It was a room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, sealed off from the rest of the world. It smelled of stale air and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old pennies. The call to the police was quick. The police then called the bureau. Within an hour, the house was full of quiet men in dark suits, their faces unreadable. Sarah stood in the hallway, her hand pressed against her mouth, watching them move in and out of the basement. They wouldn't let her down there. Not at first. They said it was an active scene, a phrase that felt wrong, 5 years too late. Daniel had vanished in 1985. He went to work one Tuesday morning and never came home. His car was found a week later in a long-term parking lot at the airport, but there was no record of him buying a ticket, no sign of him on any manifest. He was investigating the Scarlatti crime family at the time, a brutal organization known for making people disappear. The Bureau's official theory was simple and clean. Agent Sullivan got too close and was eliminated. A hero, they called him, a patriot who gave his life. Sarah accepted the folded flag at a ceremony that felt like a play, but she never believed it. Not really. Daniel wasn't careless. He was meticulous, almost to a fault. He was the kind of man who triple-checked locks and saw patterns no one else did. For him to just vanish felt like a page torn from the middle of a book. Now, this room. A room he must have built. A room he had kept from her. A young agent, his face looking far too serious for his age, finally approached her. He introduced himself as Agent Reed. He told her they had found some of Daniel's personal effects. He used that word, effects, as if her husband's life had been reduced to a box of forgotten trinkets. She asked him what they found. He hesitated. "It's an ongoing investigation, ma'am." That was the line they always used. It was a wall, just like the one in her basement. She looked past him, down the stairs, and saw another agent carry something up in a clear evidence bag. It was Daniel's badge. She recognized the worn leather of the holder. A cold wave washed over her. Why would he leave his badge behind? It was part of him, more than his wallet or his keys. It was his identity, his shield. Leaving it behind meant he was no longer an agent. Or worse, that he never planned on coming back. The questions she had buried for 5 years started to claw their way back up. Why hide a room? Why leave his badge? The official story was a clean, tragic ending. But this hidden room felt like a different story altogether, a prologue to something darker she couldn't yet comprehend. It felt like a message, left in a bottle of concrete and dust, waiting for someone to find it. Agent Reed finally led Sarah down the narrow basement stairs. The air grew colder, heavier. The room was exactly as the contractor described it, small, gray, and stark. A single bare bulb, which the agents had turned on, cast long shadows from a metal desk and a single chair. It felt less like a secret office, and more like a bunker, a place to hide not just from the world, but from something specific. On the desk, an empty space showed where the badge had been. Next to it were several thick manila folders, fanned out slightly. Each one was stamped with bold red letters, "Top Secret." Sarah had seen files like that before, when Daniel accidentally brought work home. But these were different. They weren't case files on mobsters. Reed carefully opened one. The name on the tab wasn't Scarlatti. It was a name Sarah recognized. Agent Henderson, a man who worked in Daniel's division. Why was Daniel keeping a top-secret file on a colleague? Her gaze drifted from the desk to the wall behind it. It was covered in something. a sprawling, chaotic web of symbols and numbers, drawn in a dark brownish-red substance that had dried and flaked over time. It looked like a madman's equation, a language only he could understand. It wasn't paint. It was too uneven, too organic. It looked disturbingly like dried blood. Reed made a soft noise, a sound of professional curiosity mixed with something else. Disgust, maybe. He took a picture of the wall, the flash of the camera making the grim markings jump out of the shadows. Then his eyes landed on a small object next to the files on the desk. It was a portable cassette player, the kind people used in the 80s for jogging. Beside it, a single cassette tape. It had no label, just a blank white sticker. Reed, his movements slow and deliberate, picked up the player. He checked it for batteries. It was dead. He sent another agent upstairs to find new ones. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. A tape, a message, a confession, a last will. The minutes stretched on, thick with silence and the low murmur of the agents working around them. The agent returned with fresh batteries. Reed popped them in, his fingers surprisingly steady. He inserted the cassette and pressed play. At first, there was only static. A loud hissing sound that filled the small dead space of the room. It was the sound of nothing. Sarah felt a pang of disappointment. Maybe it was just a blank tape, forgotten in a hurry. Reed was about to stop it, but he paused. He hit rewind. The whirring of the tape rewinding was a high-pitched scream in the quiet basement. He let it go for about a minute, then pressed play again. The static returned, but this time, underneath the hiss, there was something else. A sound, faint, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling. It was the sound of someone crying. A man, trying to stifle his sobs, his breath catching in ragged, desperate gasps. It was a sound of pure, undiluted misery. You feel the air go cold, a chill that has nothing to do with the concrete walls. You hear the weeping, and for a second you think you recognize the voice. It's him. It has to be him. But the sound is distorted, muffled, as if recorded from far away, or through a wall. The weeping continued for 20 seconds, then stopped, replaced by the empty hiss of the static. Reed stared at the cassette player, his professional mask finally cracking. He looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with a question he didn't dare ask. Was that Daniel? Before Sarah could answer, a voice came from the top of the stairs. What in God's name is going on down there? It was Agent Miller, Daniel's old partner, the man who had been like a brother to him. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the desk, the files, the terrifying wall. He looked at the cassette player in Reed's hand, and his expression hardened into a mask of pure denial. Agent Miller descended the stairs slowly, his gaze fixed on the cassette player as if it were a venomous snake. He was older now, the 5 years since Daniel's disappearance having carved deep lines into his face. He had been the one to comfort Sarah, the one who promised the Bureau would turn over every stone. He was family, or so she had thought. What is that? Miller asked, his voice tight. Agent Reed, recovering his composure, answered formally. A cassette tape, sir. We found it here in the room. Miller looked at Sarah, then back at Reed. And what's on it? Reed hesitated, glancing at Sarah. It's disturbing. It sounds like a man weeping. Miller let out a short, harsh laugh that didn't sound like a laugh at all. Weeping? Dan wasn't a weeper. He was the toughest agent I ever knew. He walked over to the desk, his presence filling the small space. He pointed a finger at the files. These shouldn't be here. Whatever this is, it's not right. Dan was investigating the Scarlatus. This is something else. He made it sound like an accusation, as if Daniel had done something wrong, something shameful. Sarah felt a flare of anger. He built this room, Mark, she said, her voice shaking slightly. He hid these things. Don't you want to know why? Miller's eyes softened for a moment as he looked at her, but the hardness returned when he turned back to Reed. This scene needs to be secured under a classified protocol. No one else sees this. No one. Is that understood, Agent? Reed nodded, though his expression was unreadable. Yes, sir. Miller's focus then shifted to the wall, covered in symbols. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tight. Paranoia, he muttered, almost to himself. The job gets to you. You start seeing shadows everywhere. He must have been under immense stress. He was trying to build a narrative, a story that would explain all of this away. Stress, paranoia, a breakdown. It was a clean explanation, just like the old one. It meant the bureau didn't have to look at itself too closely. But Sarah wasn't buying it. She remembered the last few weeks before Daniel vanished. He wasn't paranoid. He was scared. There was a difference. Paranoia is the fear of something that isn't there. Daniel was afraid of something very, very real. Reed, meanwhile, was carefully placing the top-secret files into evidence bags. He handled them with a reverence that bordered on fear. He knew what it meant for an agent to be keeping clandestine files on his own partners. It was the ultimate sin within the Bureau, a breach of the sacred trust that held the entire institution together. It meant Daniel didn't trust the people he worked with. And the first name on that list of people he didn't trust was right there in the room with them, Agent Mark Miller. As Reed sealed the bag containing the file on Agent Henderson, he noticed something tucked inside the folder, a small, black and white photograph. He carefully slid it out. It was a surveillance photo, grainy and taken from a distance. It showed two men standing by a car on a deserted road. One of the men was Henderson, the other was Miller. They weren't just talking. Miller was handing Henderson a thick envelope. The look on both their faces was not friendly. It was transactional, cold, and secretive. Reed quietly slipped the photo back into the folder before Miller could see it. He now had a piece of evidence that suggested Miller wasn't just trying to control the narrative, he was part of it. The weeping on the tape, the files on his colleagues, the photo of a secret meeting. This wasn't a story of a man breaking down. It was the story of a man who had uncovered a conspiracy. And he had paid the price for it. The year 1985 floods back into memory, not as a single event, but as a slow, creeping dread. It hadn't been a sudden storm, but a gradual darkening of the sky. Daniel had started coming home late, his eyes hollowed out, his shoulders slumped with a weight he refused to share. He, who used to tell Sarah everything, began to build walls. The laughter that once filled their house faded into tense silence. He would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at nothing, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. One night, Sarah found him in the basement, surrounded by bags of cement and tools she'd never seen before. He was building a wall, mixing concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow. The work was frantic, desperate. When she asked him what he was doing, he didn't look at her. "Just putting in that wine cellar we always wanted," he'd said, his voice flat and unconvincing. The lie hung in the damp air between them. A wine cellar didn't need a solid steel door, which she saw leaning against the far wall, its new lock gleaming under the single bare bulb. A few weeks before he disappeared, he woke her up in the middle of the night. He was standing by the window, looking out at the dark, empty street. He told her, "If anything ever happens to me, don't believe the first story they tell you." His voice was low, urgent. She sat up in bed, her heart starting to pound. "What are you talking about, Dan? What's going on?" He turned to face her, and in the faint moonlight, she could see the raw fear in his eyes. It was a look she had never seen on him before, not even when he was describing the most dangerous parts of his job. He said, "Just promise me. Trust your gut. Don't trust them. Not even Mark." The mention of his partner's name sent a shock through her. Not Mark? Mark Miller was their son's godfather. He was at their house for dinner at least once a week. They were closer than brothers. Why wouldn't she trust Mark? Daniel just shook his head, refusing to say more. "It's better if you don't know," he whispered. That was the last real conversation they ever had about it. After that, he became a ghost in his own home. He began sleeping in the guest room. She would hear him late at night, pacing the floor. Sometimes, she would hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of a pen on paper, coming from the basement. He was down there in his secret room, writing on the walls, documenting a truth he couldn't speak aloud. Looking back now, standing in the cold reality of that hidden room in 1990, Sarah understood. The secret room wasn't for wine. It was a vault for his fear. It was a place to hide the evidence of a betrayal so deep it had shattered the foundation of his world. He hadn't been paranoid. He had been betrayed. And the person he trusted most in the world, his own partner, was the one he warned her against. The pieces were all there, scattered across 5 years of grief and silence. Now, they were finally starting to come together, forming a picture more horrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The weeping on the tape wasn't the sound of a man breaking down. It was the sound of a man who knew he was about to die. The cassette tape became the focal point of the entire investigation. Agent Reed knew that whatever was on it, however faint, was the key. He bypassed Miller, citing chain of custody protocols, and took the tape directly to the FBI's audio forensics lab in Quantico. He told them to use every resource they had to pull the sound from the static. For 3 days, Sarah waited. The house felt different now, violated. The secret in the basement was out, and its darkness seemed to seep up through the floorboards. Miller called her twice, his voice oozing with false concern. He told her the Bureau was handling it, that she should try not to worry. He said they were exploring the theory that Daniel had suffered a psychological break. He was testing the story on her, trying to see if it would stick. She listened politely and said nothing. The wall between them was now as real and as cold as the concrete one in her basement. On the 4th day, Reed called. He didn't say much on the phone, just asked if he could come over. When he arrived, his face was grim. He carried a small, professional-grade tape player. "We were able to isolate the audio," he said, his voice low. "We filtered out most of the static. It's clearer now." He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of her living room, a silent, somber messenger. "There's more than just the weeping, Mrs. Sullivan. There's a voice. 2 voices, actually." He pressed play. The sound that came out was cleaner, sharper. First, the weeping. It was undeniably Daniel. The sound of her husband's grief was so raw, so pure, it felt like a physical blow. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she gripped the arm of her chair. But then, behind the sobbing, another sound emerged. A voice. It was distorted, muffled, like it was spoken from the other side of a door, but the words were now horribly, sickeningly clear. A man says, "Is he talking?" A second voice, deeper and rougher, replies, "Not yet." Then, after a pause, filled with the chilling sound of Daniel's quiet crying, the first voice spoke again. The words were cold, devoid of any emotion. "He knows. End it." The tape clicked off, and silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Sarah sat frozen, the 4 words echoing in her mind. "He knows. End it." It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a man who ran away. It was an execution, a cold, calculated order to kill a federal agent because he knew something he shouldn't. The last 5 years of uncertainty, of false hope, of clinging to the possibility that he might one day walk through the door, all of it collapsed in that one moment. The truth was brutal and absolute. Reed watched her, his expression a mixture of pity and professional resolve. "The voice print analysis is not a perfect match due to the distortion," he said softly, "but it's highly probable that the second voice, the one who gave the order, belongs to a senior agent within the Bureau." The investigation had just crossed a terrifying line. It was no longer a cold case. It was an internal affairs nightmare, a hunt for a killer hiding within the ranks of the FBI itself. And Daniel's files, the ones hidden in the basement, were no longer the ramblings of a paranoid mind. They were a hit list, or rather, a suspect list, written by the victim himself. Agent Reed returned to his office with the chilling audio still ringing in his ears. The words "ended" had transformed the case. He was no longer just an agent cleaning up a cold file. He was standing on the edge of a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of the Bureau. He locked his office door, a gesture that felt both futile and necessary. He spread Daniel Sullivan's secret files across his desk. The names, the surveillance logs, the grainy photos. It was a map of betrayal. He started cross-referencing the codenames in the files with agent rosters from 1985. It was slow, painstaking work. He had to request the files under a different case number to avoid tipping anyone off. He felt a constant prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He didn't know who he could trust. Every colleague who walked past his office door was a potential suspect. After 2 days of work, a pattern began to emerge. One name appeared over and over, connecting the others. It was the linchpin holding the entire rotten structure together. Agent Mark Miller, Sullivan's partner, his best friend. According to Daniel's notes, Miller was the one who controlled the flow of information. He was the one meeting with other agents in secret, passing envelopes, arranging transfers. Daniel had suspected him of feeding information to the Scarlatti family, but his final, frantic notes suggested he had stumbled onto something far worse. It wasn't just corruption. It was a shadow operation running inside the Bureau itself, using the Scarlatti investigation as a cover. Reed felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had looked Miller in the eye. He had listened to the man's confident denials and his practiced concern. He had almost believed him. Now he had to confront him, but he knew he couldn't do it directly. A direct accusation would be career suicide. Miller was a senior agent with powerful friends. Reed needed more than just a dead man's notes. He found Miller in the break room pouring a cup of coffee. Reed approached him casually, feigning a minor roadblock in the investigation. "Mark," he began, "I was looking through the old Scarlatti case files, the official ones. There are some timeline inconsistencies around the time Dan disappeared. You were lead investigator after he vanished. Did you ever feel like something was off?" Miller stirred his coffee, not looking at Reed. "It was a chaotic time. We lost one of our own. Things get missed." His tone was dismissive. Reed pressed on. "The file on Henderson, for instance. He was transferred out of the division a week after Dan went missing. The reason cited was a family issue, but Dan's notes seemed to suggest otherwise." At the mention of Henderson, Miller's hand paused for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny tell, but Reed saw it. "Sullivan was seeing ghosts, son," Miller said, finally turning to face him. His eyes were cold steel. "He was a good agent, but he went too deep. He lost perspective. I'm telling you, for your own good, let it go. Close the file. The man is dead. Let him rest." It was a warning, delivered with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. Let it go. The same sentiment as the voice on the tape. The message was clear. Stop digging, or you'll end up in a hole yourself. Reed walked away, his heart pounding. He now knew for certain that Miller was not just a witness. He was a gatekeeper, and he was guarding a very dark secret. The confrontation, as subtle as it was, had drawn a line in the sand. Reed was on one side, and the full, unseen weight of the Bureau's darkest elements was on the other. Sarah couldn't sit still. The house, once a sanctuary of memories, now felt like a cage. The words on the tape, "He knows," "End it," played on a loop in her mind. She knew Miller was lying. She could feel it. The way he looked at her, the way he spoke about Daniel with that mix of pity and dismissal, it was all a performance. She refused to be a grieving widow, sitting on the sidelines while her husband's murderer covered his tracks. She decided to do what Daniel had told her to do all those years ago. Trust her gut. And her gut told her there was still something in the house, something Daniel had left for her. She began to search, not for anything obvious, but for the things Daniel had hidden in plain sight. He loved books, history books in particular. Their shelves were lined with them. She started pulling them out one by one, shaking them, fanning the pages. For hours, she found nothing but dust. She was about to give up when she picked up a thick volume on the Civil War, a book he often read. As she held it, she noticed the spine was slightly loose. She worked her fingernail into the seam and gently pried it open. Tucked inside the binding was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a key, a simple substitution cipher. A series of symbols, the same strange chicken scratch markings from the basement wall, were listed next to letters of the alphabet. It was his code, the one he had been using to write his final message. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call Miller. She called the one person she now believed she could trust. Agent Reed. She told him what she had found, her voice low and urgent. An hour later, he was at her kitchen table. Together, they looked at the photo Reed had taken of the wall. The strange, sprawling symbols no longer looked like mad scribbles. They were words. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to translate. They worked in silence. The only sound, the scratching of Reed's pen as he wrote down the letters. The message was not long. It was short, direct, and terrifyingly specific. It was a final intelligence report from a dying agent. It read, "Miller is the conduit. Internal program. Codename Pilgrim. They clean house." The last part was what made Reed's blood run cold. They clean house. It wasn't just about corruption or selling secrets. It was an internal execution squad, sanctioned to eliminate threats from within. The final line of the message was not words, but a location and a date. Northwood Cabin, 10/29/85. Sarah looked at the date, October 29th, 1985. That was 2 days after Daniel was officially declared missing. Northwood Cabin. Reed recognized the name. It was a remote Bureau-owned property, deep in the mountains, used for witness protection layovers and occasional agent retreats. It was supposed to be a safe house. But Daniel's message painted it as something else entirely. A slaughterhouse. A place where the Bureau took its own to be silenced forever. Reed looked at Sarah, the horror of their discovery reflected in her eyes. He now had the key and the location. He knew what he had to do. He would have to go there, off the books. It was an incredible risk. If he was wrong, his career was over. If he was right, his life could be. The drive to Northwood Cabin was 3 hours of tense silence. Agent Reed didn't file a formal request or tell his superiors where he was going. He brought one other agent with him, a young analyst from the forensics team named Peterson, who was too new to be compromised and too smart to be fooled. Reed had told him just enough to make him understand the gravity of the situation, but not enough to make him a target if things went wrong. They drove in an unmarked car, the decrypted message from the wall folded in Reed's pocket. It felt heavy, like a death sentence. The cabin was even more remote than Reed had imagined. It sat at the end of a long, unpaved logging road, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to swallow all sound. The cabin itself was small and unassuming, made of dark wood that was starting to rot. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were boarded up, and a heavy padlock was on the door. According to official records, the cabin had been decommissioned in 1987 due to structural issues. It had been abandoned, left to decay. Reed cut the padlock with a pair of bolt cutters. The sound was loud and sharp in the dead quiet of the woods. The door creaked open into a single room, filled with dust and the smell of mold. There was a stone fireplace, a broken table, and 2 rotting cots. It was the picture of neglect. But Reed wasn't looking at the furniture. He was looking at the floor. The wide wooden floorboards were covered in a thick layer of dust, but near the fireplace, he saw something. Scuff marks and faint dark stains that had soaked deep into the wood. Someone had dragged something heavy across this floor. "Check the floorboards," Reed said to Peterson, his voice low. They got on their hands and knees, running their hands over the rough planks. Near the hearth, Peterson found it. One of the boards was loose. They used a crowbar to pry it up. Underneath was not dirt, but a dark, empty space. The smell that rose from the hole was sickeningly sweet. The smell of decay. Reed shone his flashlight into the darkness. It was a shallow crawl space, but it wasn't empty. There, lying in the dirt, were human remains, wrapped in a thick plastic tarp. For a moment, no one spoke. The reality of what they had found was overwhelming. This was it. This was Daniel Sullivan's grave. Peterson, his face pale, carefully climbed down into the space to begin the grim task of documentation. As he worked around the remains, his light caught a glint of metal. It wasn't a belt buckle or a wedding ring. It was nestled in the dirt next to the body. He reached down and picked it up. It was another FBI badge. But it wasn't Daniel's. Reed had seen Daniel's badge, the one from the secret room. This one was different. Peterson handed it up to Reed. Reed wiped the dirt from the surface. The name on the badge was Agent Robert Henderson, the same Agent Henderson from Daniel's secret files, the same Agent Miller was photographed with. According to Bureau records, Henderson had died in a fiery car crash, a full year before Daniel Sullivan ever went missing. The official story was a tragic accident. But here was his badge, buried with another murdered agent in a secret grave. The conspiracy wasn't just about killing Daniel. It was bigger, older. How many others were there? How many agents had been cleaned by this shadow program, their deaths covered up with neat official stories? Daniel hadn't just uncovered corruption. He had uncovered a secret graveyard, and the Bureau itself had buried the bodies. The discovery in the cabin set off a quiet firestorm within the FBI. It could no longer be ignored or explained away as the paranoia of a single agent. Reed and Peterson's unofficial excursion became a full-blown, top-secret internal investigation. The remains were confirmed to be Daniel Sullivan's. The cause of death was a single gunshot to the back of the head, an execution. But the presence of Henderson's badge created a problem for the people at the top. It was evidence of a second murder, a second cover-up. It pointed to a systemic, horrifying program. Reed presented his findings, including the decoded message from the wall and the audio from the tape, to a deputy director in a sealed room. He laid out the entire conspiracy, pointing directly at Miller as the conduit and the mysterious Pilgrim program as the mechanism. He thought he was bringing the truth to light. He was wrong. He was bringing it to the people who had the most to lose if it ever got out. A week later, the official story was crafted. It was a masterpiece of institutional preservation. The Bureau announced it had solved the 5-year-old mystery of Agent Daniel Sullivan's disappearance. According to the new narrative, Sullivan had discovered that his colleague, Agent Henderson, was a rogue agent selling secrets. Henderson, realizing he was caught, murdered Sullivan and buried him at the remote cabin. Then, overwhelmed by guilt, Henderson staged his own death in a car crash and vanished. The story was clean, tragic, and most importantly, contained. It turned Henderson into the lone villain and Sullivan into the hero who had uncovered him. It explained both bodies in a way. What about Miller? Reed had asked. What about the Pilgrim program? The deputy director had looked at him with cold, tired eyes. Agent Miller, he was told, was a patriot who had been forced to participate in a sanctioned internal deception to protect the Bureau from a massive scandal. His meetings with Henderson were part of a sting operation. He was being quietly forced into early retirement for his procedural missteps. He would not be charged. He would simply disappear from the Bureau, his pension intact. The program itself, they said, never existed. It was a fiction Sullivan had created in his stressed and paranoid state. The decoded message was dismissed as unreliable. The audio tape was deemed inconclusive. The entire truth was buried, deeper and more securely than Daniel Sullivan's body had ever been. The system was protecting itself. The monster Daniel had discovered was not a single rogue agent. The monster was the institution itself, and it would not allow itself to be wounded. Reed was promoted for closing a famous cold case, a reward that felt like blood money. He was now part of the machine, his silence bought and paid for. He had won, but he had lost. He had found the truth, only to watch it be twisted into a lie that everyone could live with. It was the perfect murder, not because the killer got away, but because the murder itself was officially erased from history. The case was closed. The headlines praised the FBI for its relentless pursuit of justice. The story of the hero agent, Daniel Sullivan, and the rogue agent, Robert Henderson, became a cautionary tale told to new recruits at Quantico. It was a neat, tidy lie, polished and preserved in the official records. Agent Miller retired quietly, moving to a small town in Florida where he couldn't be found. Agent Reed continued his career, the promotion a heavy weight on his shoulders. He knew the truth, and that knowledge was its own kind of prison. He saw the shadow of the Pilgrim program, in every redacted file, in every unexplained agent transfer. He saw it in the eyes of the senior executives who knew he knew, a silent, shared understanding of the secrets they were all forced to keep. For Sarah, the conclusion of the case brought no peace. She received another folded flag, another round of condolences from men in dark suits who wouldn't meet her eyes. They gave her the official story, and she listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. She knew they were lying. She had the small, folded piece of paper with Daniel's code in her jewelry box. She had the memory of his voice on the tape, not the weeping, but the whispered warning from years ago. Don't believe the first story they tell you, not even Mark. She had been given an ending, but not the truth. The world had its story, but she had his. The house was sold. She couldn't stay there anymore, couldn't walk through the rooms without feeling the weight of the secrets under the floor. Before she left for the last time, she walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She stood in the living room where Reed had played her the tape, the place where her last fragile hope had shattered. She held Daniel's badge in her hand, the one from the secret room. It was worn, the metal tarnished, but it felt solid, real. It was the only piece of the real story she had left. Justice was a word that no longer meant anything to her. There was no court, no trial, no punishment that could fix what had been broken. The system her husband had given his life for, the one he believed in, was the very thing that had consumed him. It had chewed him up and spit out a more convenient version of his death. She finally understood the message he had left on the wall. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a warning. A warning that some institutions are too powerful to be reformed, that some truths are too dangerous to be told. The only closure she would ever get was the quiet, bitter knowledge of what they had done. She knew who killed her husband. She knew why, and they knew that she knew. And in that silent, unresolved standoff, a kind of peace was finally found. Not of happiness or of justice, but of a story finally, truly, understood. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.